And we are live. Camera's on you, Colin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back once again to the Cult of Copy show. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Sir Colin Theriots. As usual, if you want to know more about the Cult of Copy, or if you are being introduced to us by way of this episode, you can go to our website, cultofcopy.com. Of course, watch many more videos on this YouTube channel, youtube.com/cultofcopy. And if you want to join our Facebook group, which is approaching 16,000 members, you can look for us on Facebook. Just search Cult of Copy and you should find us there. As mentioned, this week's episode is about the Ambiguity Effect, which is another in a long line of cognitive biases and logical fallacies and decision heuristic errors that we're looking at in order to find things that we can use to influence and persuade and quote unquote manipulate people into doing what we want them to do, which in a marketing context is usually buy the stuff that we sell. Before we get into the actual meat of the episode, which should be fun, I do want to let our director Zane hop on the call for a bit here. He is going to tell us about a slight difference in YouTube's interface and how you can actually interact with us live on the show, because he is in the control booth in our orbiting moon base.
That's right.
Flipping,
it's great up here.
Yeah, flipping switches and turning dials and whatnot, and he will tell you how you can comment and ask questions and interact with us live on the show.
For sure. So what you guys are seeing right now is the actual YouTube watch page. Where you want to chat is here, because for some weird reason YouTube just disables the regular comments. So just put them over here, and I will answer. I will tell Colin the question. Also, I'm monitoring comments here on Facebook. So if you're watching from the Facebook group, I'm watching those as well. Plus, hooray! It's Colin's birthday, and that's what he looks like as a kid. So
yeah, thank you.
Right. Back on you, Colin.
I don't still have that cowboy hat, but I do still have the little rocking chair. My kids enjoy it to this day.
Cool.
So that's pretty fun. In case anybody asks, 37.
Nice. All
right. It's a good age. Good age, feeling like an adult, driving a minivan. It's good times. Good times. So, like Zane said, we do record these live. If you happen to be watching this live, he told you how to leave a comment. If you happen to be listening to a recording of this, I did want to mention that we do record live episodes, usually every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern is when we record these episodes, and you can show up and interact with us. Or, just watch it later if that's your thing. That's fine too. I'm not the boss of you. So today we're talking about something called the Ambiguity Effect, and it'll be a real good companion piece to what we talked about last week, which was the pseudocertainty principle. So last week, the pseudocertainty principle covered how people will tend to make conservative, safe decisions when a positive outcome feels more certain, and they will tend to take bigger risks and more of a gamble when it comes to making decisions of what to do if a negative outcome seems more certain if they don't. So it sort of ties into the old adage that people will tend to want to move away from pain more than they want to move toward pleasure, which is, considered a pretty well-known principle if you write advertising, that if you agitate people's pain to drive them toward your solution, it works better than trying to attract them with how great your product is. Now, the ambiguity effect is kind of similar, but what it refers to is people's tendency to want to pick choices for which the outcome is more detailed. They have more information about the outcome that they tend to want to choose, right? So the idea is that the biggest fear people have, the root of all fears basically, is a fear of the unknown. So we have a sort of unspoken automatic rule of thumb that in given a number of choices, we avoid any that have ambiguity associated with them. So if we just don't have enough information, we're not sure, we will go with the decision that gives us more information, even if the potential for a reward might be higher if we take the uncertain route, and even if the risk is low to go the uncertain route. If we have more information about a different route, people will tend to go after the one with more information, even if, and this is pretty freaky too, if the decision choice has more information is not even great. We'll talk about this in a little more detail, but to give you an example, say there's a product and you're shopping for a particular solution, and there's maybe, like, just for the sake of simplicity, two different competing products, right? One of them has a ton of reviews, but they're, mediocre. They're like 3-star reviews. The other choice has no reviews. It's brand new to the market. People will tend to pick the one that has more reviews, even though they're mediocre reviews, rather than go with the uncertain one, which may well be better. That's an example of the ambiguity effect operating in real life. So that is actually one of the main examples that I had listed here to detail to you how you encounter the ambiguity effect in real life. Another one might be like the choice between being an employee and taking a regular paycheck and collecting benefits versus being self-employed or being entrepreneurial and starting a business. That route, which many of the people watching this show either currently pursue or at least aspire to, there are more risks, but the reward is exponentially greater. However, there's very little certainty when you go that route. Now, there's plenty of things you can do to reduce the uncertainty and give yourself a plan and a good shot at being successful, but that's outside of the scope of this episode. Most people tend to feel the security of having a job where the ambiguity and the uncertainty are someone else's problem at your company, and you just show up, do what you're hired to do, collect your paycheck and your benefits, you're good to go. That's secure, it's safe, it's reliable. Even though it may not ultimately end up being more rewarding, it's more assured. It feels safer, right? People are naturally risk averse. So I tend to think, and there's all kind of psychological arguing going on between experts about what causes these particular perceptions, but I tend to think as we were evolving, uncertainty was just way too dangerous. We're wired to want to avoid it, to get away from it, just focus on things that we know, because then we can process that information and sort of get a prediction of whether it's going to be a positive outcome or not. When we don't have enough information to make a choice, we tend to avoid that choice. Now, this can also lead to something that a lot of entrepreneurial business type people refer to as paralysis by analysis, which is when you're trying to gather the information you need to make a good choice, you get stuck in a loop because there's potentially infinite information that you can collect, and you end up collecting way, 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 way more information than you need to actually make that decision. That might be something we talk about on a future episode, that tendency to do that. It's called information bias. So we could well do that. I think I maybe even did an old episode on it at some point in the past. But to get back on track, ambiguity is something people instinctually want to avoid without even thinking about it. So how can we take this concept of ambiguity and use it to drive people towards the decisions we actually want them to make, whether they're clients or customers or just people we encounter every day, that it would be better for us if they did what we wanted.
All right. We have a question here.
Okay, great. Let's do that before we dive into the hands-on part of the show.
Oh, yeah, it fits in nicely here. So reach, connect, uplift women. asks, does it change if you're dealing with men or women, or do both sexes go for security?
No, it's the trick is not necessarily to think of it as security, and whether you use that descriptive angle of presenting it as security may differ depending on if you're selling to men or women, or depending on which product you're selling to men or women. Security is a way to sort of describe the opposite of ambiguity, right? But we're not necessarily talking about security. It's just the amount of information available feels like we're making a better, more logical decision, right? Because if we have all of these informational factors about choice A, and about choice B, we know next to nothing, we feel like it's a wiser choice to go with A. It's not necessarily about security. It's just we know more about it. There's even what's the old sort of cliche parable phrase that the devil you know is better than the one you don't. You know, sort of advising to pick the lesser of two evils when you're given a choice. Well, the unknown always feels more evil and more dangerous, right? We have a tendency when we have an unknown, we don't imagine amazing, awesome outcomes in the unknown. The unknown tends to always be monsters, right? So like when they were drawing ancient maps of the world and they got to the edge of the world where they didn't know anything beyond it, they weren't like, oh yeah, it's probably like, you know, Super Fun Town over there. No, they're like, here be monsters, right? So we tend to put evil, nightmarish, terrible outcomes in the unknown. So it's not security, it's just we feel safer having more information, we feel smarter making the decision based on, okay, well, we have all this information over here and we don't know anything about what's over here. Hopefully that explains it better, but you can, depending on the scenario, use security as a way to say, okay, well, this is the safe choice, this is the secure option, whereas the other one is unsecure because you just don't know. It will really depend on the product. Hopefully that's a good answer for what you were asking. Thank you for
And that
asking.
was it. Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah.
I would thank you by name, but I can't remember your weird username. I'm sorry. If it was,
Reach, connect, uplift women.
Thank you, Reach,
Yeah.
Connect, Uplift Women. So how to use the ambiguity effect in your communication. So obviously, when you are offering a solution to the client or the prospect, your solution is the one you want them to pick out of all the other options. So you want to make sure that you include lots of knowledge and understanding of the situation along with your suggested solution, right? So what you're doing is giving them all this information so that your choice, let's call it option A, buying your product or service, is the one for which they have so much information and so much data and so much knowledge and understanding of the problem and the way your solution interacts with it that every other suggested solution just seems more vague. So that's the obvious way to do it, where you take your product and make it more detailed and information packed in their mind. So there are several ways we can do that. The ones that I detailed here would be first with data. So if you have hard numbers on results, percentages of people who use your product who succeed, percentages of people in the total marketplace that buy your product, percentage of people that are happy, low percentage of returns, percent return on investment. And then it doesn't even have to be percent. We're just talking about data, numbers, results, measurable, visible, tangible, obvious data that you can use that shows your product being something that solves that problem and maybe gives some additional benefits beyond that mere solution, right? The next thing you can use that can factor into making them feel like your choice has more information for them to process would be testimonials or endorsements. Essentially, what those are instances, to the prospect and to the client of your product being used and benefiting the user in the way that they're hoping it will do for them. So it's use cases, it's scenarios, it's different stories in their mind that stack up and make it seem like your product has more going for it. There's more known, the more you can have testimonials that maybe give specific little details that make it seem unique, the more it feels like in the prospective client's mind that it's hard to explain, but it's basically like bunches and bunches of copies of your product being used in all these different scenarios. And it makes it seem, instead of being a very specific, narrow thing in their mind, now it sort of unfolds like a Swiss Army knife, right? Like it's got all of these different subtleties and applications and different ways it could apply. And it makes it seem like a much more robust and effective overall solution to them. And again, you were on the balance of scales where they have option A, buying your product, and option B, not. We're loading up the scale on the option A side, so it keeps getting heavier and heavier because they have more and more information. Now, the subtle difference, in case you haven't heard me talk about it before, you don't know yourself, testimonials are stories about personal use of your products from actual customers, real people, right? Then you have endorsements, which are slightly different. Those are statements of support about your product from figures who are well known to your target audience for some reason. Maybe they're an expert, maybe they're just a celebrity, but they are someone aspirational and inspirational to your audience, so that when they say your product is good, they're like, oh, well, if that guy likes it, it must be great. There can be some overlap between an endorsement and a testimonial, but an endorsement doesn't necessarily imply that the person plugging your product has actually used it themselves. Now, depending on where you live, there are advertising laws about disclosures and all that. That's outside of the scope of the show. I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. You should have someone competent in advertising law in your area. Look at your ads before you get into using testimonials and endorsements, because there are all laws pertaining to those things. But in general, the difference between the two is that an endorsement is where you're trying to piggyback off of someone's influence over your audience to get them to buy your product, and a testimonial is an actual hands-on experience. You include more of those in your description of your product or solution, and it will make that solution seem more robust. Oops. I had to get a new iPad, you guys, and this one has the keypad every time it goes to sleep. And boy, I'm about to trade security for convenience on that one. Because I will say probably about 7 times out of 10, I typed the password in wrong the first time. Let's see. Okay, and then the last way, actually, I just thought of another one, so we'll talk about 2. The next way that you can use the ambiguity effect to make your own product and solution more desirable is using metaphors, right? So if you can give someone a metaphorical explanation of your product and its relationship to the problem, that gives the client a more detailed understanding of the situation. An example might be the whole give a man a fish sort of scenario. You know, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you can feed him for a lifetime. Or, you know, any number of little business parables like that you can apply to your scenario, where you give someone a metaphor that helps them understand why your choice is the better choice. Again, even though these are just little metaphors, they feel like more factual, influential information on side A, weighing that choice down more in their mind as a more rational choice. In addition to metaphors, the one that I just thought of is, of course, storytelling. So I mentioned briefly how a testimonial is a sort of story about how that customer used your product. But when you're describing your product to your customers and you explain what the problems were that led to its creation and what it was like to go through that, how you came up with the idea to create this particular solution, how you tested it on your own stuff and on other people's stuff and got people like them who have used it for themselves and got great results and are happy. All of these stories you can tell about your product or solution. Again, even though they're stories and they're not data, they're not, backed up by research or whatever, they're just person to person stories. It's information. It's increasing the pile of available information on the decision you want them to have. Now, this being the cult of copy, and we tend to have a tendency to look on the darker side of things. I always advise you take the flip side of the coin, and you don't just make your product look good using the ambiguity effect. Use the ambiguity effect to also make all the competing choices look worse. And it's actually pretty easy with the ambiguity effect. So here we're talking about not just direct competitors, like people who make and sell alternatives to your solution, but also competing choices are, doing nothing at all, walking away and thinking about it, shopping around. I got to talk to the wife. Basically any objection that would have them walk away from agreeing to the sale that's in front of them right now could be considered an alternative choice to buying, right? So you want to give them a way to see all of those different options as being more ambiguous and uncertain, right? What that does, again, is it creates a counterpoint to what we did before, where we were making your choice seem like it had more information, more facts to back it up. See, I just did it again. I typed it in wrong when I went to sleep. So how do you add confusion and uncertainty to the choices that you don't want your audience to make? A few ways we can do it. First, do we know who created the solution? What's its pedigree? What's its history? So you told the audience about your product, who made it, how it was made, why is it made out of the stuff it's made out of, all these things. Do they know that about the competing products? Probably not off the top of their head. Maybe they could go research that kind of thing online and find out if you wanted. But remember, we're talking about a decision that's right in front of them. You laid out all this information. It's already there. Side A is way more heavy than side B on that. Now, they could run off and go research side B and try and even it out, but we don't want them to. We just want to point out all the things that they don't know about the other choices out there. So not just your competitors, but obviously it's very easy to make the choice of doing nothing about this problem that they have feel like very uncertain, very ambiguous, right? Maybe things will stay exactly the same, which is not great, but they don't hurt. But maybe things will get worse. The problem you have will somehow, compound in some way. The pain will get greater. It will degrade more. It will be harder to treat the longer you leave it alone, the same way that if you don't get a cavity filled early, it only gets deeper and deeper and more chance to get painful and need a root canal. And then, they'll have to yank your whole jaw off and give you a 3D printed one. You get the idea. I'm being a little extreme there with the slippery slope, but that's an example of how you can put ambiguity and uncertainty into the competing solutions. Now, we can also do things like, if the source of the solution that competes with yours is known, if you have grounds to do so, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not recommending you libel anyone or anything like this, but if you can somehow do what's called an ad hominem attack in debate, where you question the source in some way, as opposed to the actual product itself. An example of a way you could maybe do this where we're not specifically criticizing a specific competitor would be, our ingredients are all 100% organic, and we work directly with the farms that supply them. And other manufacturers of a beauty product like this source these materials as a commodity, and they could be shipped from many different countries, produced in many different factories all over the world with widely varying standards of quality and controls in place to make sure it's good. We, on the other hand, inspect all of our partners on a yearly basis to make sure they are sticking to our stringent expectations of quality control, because we know that matters to you, right? That would be one way you could do it without actually pointing the finger at anybody. And there are many examples in the history of advertising where this has been used. It's sort of like an implied ambiguity. So, like for Lucky Strike cigarettes, when they said, it's toasted, we toast our tobacco. Well, everybody toasts their tobacco before they put it in cigarettes. But Lucky Strike said it first, and it made it seem like other guys don't. Do they? I don't know. It's ambiguous. So there's that choice. And it's the same with, I think it was an Ogilvy campaign, or maybe Collier. Gosh, I don't know. I can't remember. I'm bad with names, but it's a famous advertising campaign for Schlitz beer, and they talk about the purity of the water because of all this filtration stuff they do to get the water super pure before they use it to brew the beer. Well, every brewer did that, but because they pointed it out and talked about it in such detail, it raises questions about the processes all the other brewers use. Are they using dirty sewer water straight out of the toilet? I don't know. Is there even a way to ask them and find out? You know, it sort of puts the ball in the competitor's court for them to have to defend themselves now, even though, you know, I'm sure it's federally regulated industry standard that you sanitize your water before you make commercially sold beer out of it. But those are examples of how that's been used, where you can question the source, not necessarily the product itself, but you can sort of mess with the ingredients and the way that it's manufactured and add uncertainty and even confusion into that. Now, we mentioned metaphors when we were talking about making your product seem better. Metaphors can also be used to make the bad alternatives seem more confusing. Again, we talked about that phrase, the devil you know is better than the one you don't. That is basically a metaphor that works both ways. It's making the option you have more information about seem more appealing, while making the one that you don't seem potentially worse. So if you're using a metaphor to describe the alternatives, you want to talk about how it's confusing. And of course, I didn't write down any examples of these metaphors ahead of time. That would have made the show a little better, but hopefully if you stockpile metaphors to use in your writing, persuasive writing, and you should, you'll be able to look at a few of these and realize, okay, well, what this metaphor does is it makes one of the two items we're comparing more confusing, more uncertain, you know, even go ahead.
I was going to ask, is that why that guy Dr. Phil is so good? Because he's always got like stacks of metaphors that he uses to explain things.
Yes. Metaphors are very powerful, and if you have a little folksy, you know, anecdote that you can use to metaphorically explain things, it can be very powerful because it gives people that little rush of an aha moment where you're giving them a new understanding about a complicated thing that all of a sudden makes it simple. But even just using metaphorical language to describe these things, right? So our tech support is direct. You ring the phone, you call the phone, it rings in our office. I could hear it from my desk. My support team sits right down the hall, and they're answering your calls right here in-house where we develop the product. Versus you buy it from a big national provider, your call rings in a call center overseas to an outsourced company that does tech support routing for maybe 15 different companies. They route your call to another outsourced tech support department, and you're stuck in this maze, right? There's your metaphor. You're stuck in this maze of tech support trying to get help with your issue, having to talk to 10 or 20 people who have no idea how to solve your problem before you can find someone who's even qualified with that particular solution. That description is metaphorical. You're making yours seem very easy, and you're comparing theirs to some sort of, gauntlet of tricks and traps, like the temple Indiana Jones steals the idol from at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, just as an example. And then finally, when it comes to storytelling, we sort of touched on this with all the other examples, but when you are trying to make other solutions not seem as good, you can use stories to sort of make their perception of the other outcomes suddenly not as sure as it might be, right? And you can use this by finding what I call negative testimonials, which are stories told by people who gave like negative reviews of other experiences and present those anecdotally. So I've heard of a woman who bought another popular alternative to our product, and when she used it in her hair, it not only changed the color in a bad way, it started falling out in clumps. Now, don't make stuff like that up. Obviously, you would want to find the source for that if someone said that about a competing product. And again, if you're gonna start saying things that make your competition look bad in a way where they could get mad and maybe come after you legally, check with a lawyer before you publish that kind of thing. But that's just an example of where you're finding stories that people have put out there and published of their own experience, and now you're using them to attach to competing solutions to your solution. And when your readers, when your prospects consume those messages, now all of a sudden the alternative solutions are becoming ambiguous instead of, okay, well, all things considered, you sell this, they sell that, they both solve the problem, people like both of them, they're even, right, in the prospect's mind. But when you start sharing these stories, now all of a sudden the competing solutions are uncertain. You're not saying those solutions are bad. Maybe that won't happen, but maybe it will. And now they're unsure. And you paint your solution as having less ambiguity. So again, it just stacks the deck in your favor. But from their point of view, all you're doing is talking about them equally. And in fact, it can be a sneaky trick because people sort of weigh their options on like the size of the pile of information they have about it. So if you talk about your option A, for 5 paragraphs, say for the sake of argument, and you talk about all the competing solutions, option B, for the same amount of paragraphs, in their mind, you're weighing them evenly. You're being fair. You're being honest. But all the information in the 5 paragraphs on your side make your outcome seem certain, and all the paragraphs on the other side make those outcomes seem uncertain. They're not equal. They're actually very, very skewed. But in their mind, it seems like you gave it a fair shake explaining both sides. And when they decide to go with yours, they feel like it's a purely logical decision that they made entirely on their own, even though that is not the case. So that's it. That's all we had for the ambiguity effect this week. I feel like it's a really simple one, pretty straightforward. We went right within our little half-hour time limit there. So good job, me. Yay. Before I depart and have a birthday beer and plan up some stuff before we go out of town for the holiday, like I said, this is the last show of the year, but we'll be back in January with exciting news. I'm getting a new office. It's even bigger than this one, and I'll have a dedicated space to shooting video. And it has a fireplace, so I'll get to recreate this set almost exactly, just in a much bigger room. I don't know if the next show will be in that new space yet, but I am moving in January, so that should be fun. And if anyone has any last questions or comments on this, our final show of the year, I'll let Zane dig through those, and if not, we'll see you next year.
Yeah, we've got a couple here. Just mostly like from Eric Kruger. He said happy birthday, right? The big 3-7.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, got a couple of other comments. So why don't you do the preview for the next show?
Oh yeah,
Um,
let me look
and
up what
then
that is.
yeah, and then I'll fire off the last of the comments and also encourage now's the chance if you got any more questions or comments we can
Yeah,
do that.
please do. If you're listening live, we're one of the only shows that do that, where you can jump in and chit chat with us with no safety net. Yeah, so next week, well, not next week, but in our next show, which will be in January in the new year, we are talking about the impact effect, and I don't know what that is, so we're going to look it up real fast. It's my birthday. Give me a break. I'm a little unprepared.
Oh, and folks, while he's doing this, do us a favor that once the show is not live, the YouTube comments turn back on. So if you could just drop a comment, happy birthday to him, so he can look back on this day and go, oh yeah, I remember that.
Okay, so next week's episode, if you want to join us here on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/cult of copy, when we record our new episode, it will be about impact bias, which is our tendency to overestimate our emotional response to future events. So if you, for example, can tell someone that something bad might happen to them in the future, they will be very, very worried about it because, oh my gosh, something terrible is going to happen and it'll be horrible and I'll hate it. But if that thing actually happened to them, they would probably just kind of roll with it, right? Like, we tend to overreact about imagined future negative outcomes. And that is impact bias. And when we have our next episode, we are going to talk about what it is, how you encounter it in your day-to-day life, and how you can use it to trick people into buying more of your stuff. That's going to be episode 33 of the Cult of Copy Show, Impact Bias. And we'll see you for that episode sometime in January. Check your YouTube channel, youtube.com/cult of copy, for information on that new episode. That's it for me from this week. So, last few questions of the year, Zane.
Mostly happy birthdays. Shane says happy birthday. Eric, reach, connect, uplift women. Everybody says happy birthday. This is a great show, and just wrap it up with a nice.
Oh,
All right, well done. Happy New Year. Later.
Happy New Year. Bye, everybody.